Last year almost killed me because I was promoting Character Matters while writing this book. And so 2025, Massee is just a blur to me because I was either on the book tour or writing, and the combination. So this year is a little easier because I'm not writing, but I'm taking 2027 off. Yeah, I'm going to watch Netflix every day, all year. And then in 2028, I'll rethink.
Good. There's still so much in you.
Yeah.
You know? Absolutely. Good afternoon and welcome to our discussion today with Gene Becker. Gene is a prominent author and former chief of staff to President George H.W. Bush from 1994 until 2018 when he passed away. She's known for managing his post-presidential office and authoring bestsellers including on his life, including The Man I Knew. Previously, she was Deputy Press Secretary to First Lady Barbara Bush from 1989 until 1992, and she was also a 10-year journalist, including at the USA Today. So welcome, Gene.
Thank you.
Welcome, Gene.
Is this on? Can you hear me? I'm thrilled to be back. I was here a year ago, and I want to I see some familiar faces. And I want to thank you for being here because the Cherry Blossom Festival has so much to offer. So thank you for choosing me. I appreciate it. I'll try not to let you down.
So, Gene, getting right into the book that you just published, the main emphasis is on the advance work of the White House and the presidency. Can you tell us about some of the most harrowing near-disaster events that happened during that time?
I'll just hold up the book. I don't think we have a slide of it, but this is the book. It's called Don't Tell the President, the Best, Worst, and Mostly Untold Stories from Presidential Advance. And for example, when President George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush came to Marshfield in, I think, 1991, to march in your 4th of July parade, there would have been an advance team here for a week to figure out the logistics, they're the ones who get everything organized, so by the time Air Force One lands, everything goes perfect. So this was a very fun book to write. I had a co-author, Tom Collimore, who was supposed to come with me, but he's been having some health issues, so I told him to stay home. I'm from Missouri, and I now live in Houston, but I said, these are my people. I got this. I'll go to the Cherry Blossom Festival. But there are stories. First of all, you should know that there are stories from LBJ through President Obama. We purposely did not include President Biden or President Trump because it's too soon. These are stories better told when they're in the rearview mirror and when the principal is off stage. So there's everything from 9/11, very touching 9/11 story. One of the more touching stories is when President Obama went to Sandy Hook Elementary School after the entire first grade class was murdered. The advanced man who wrote about that. So there's a whole chapter called Advancing History. The day President Reagan was shot, the day Sarah Jane Moore tried to shoot President Ford. So, but then there's funny stories. And I'm going to start with one of the funnier stories because Marie is here from President Clinton's world, who worked for President Clinton for years. So it's 1992, and Governor Bill Clinton is running against President George H.W. Bush, who of course is from Texas. And the Clinton-Gore campaign team is doing a bus tour through Texas. And the advance team, 2 young men who had just gotten out of college, they're in Corsicana, Texas, halfway between Houston and Dallas, and the bus tour is coming through that day, and they managed to lock themselves out of their car. Well, the luckiest thing that happened to them, they're in downtown Corsicana, and lo and behold, there's a locksmith shop on the very block where their car is. And then these two young men did the dumbest thing they could have possibly done. They walk into the locksmith store shop and tell him, we're with the Clinton-Gore campaign, and we just locked ourselves out of our car. So the owner of the shop is sitting in a rocking chair, and he looked at the two of them and he said, "I don't do outside jobs." I think you know that makes no sense. And these two, they just were out of college, and they said, "Our car is right there. It's right there." And this guy, this good old boy Texan, looked out the door and said, "That's outside? I don't go outside." And he refused to unlock their car. So they had to use a rock to break the window to get into the car. That would have been an interesting campaign expense report. But the fun thing about the book is, again, it has stories, everything from that to 9/11. So it's just a lot of fun. By the way, I talked to the guy who wrote that essay, the Clinton Gore advance guy, and I said, "I'm sort of embarrassed that this happened in Texas." He said, "Jean, let's be honest. If the Bush quail team had locked themselves out of their car in Arkansas, same thing."
Gene, moving on, what would you say is the biggest misconception about planning, a behind-the-scenes, high-stakes presidential visit?
That's a great question. I've been on the book tour since February, and you're the first one to ask me that question. Maybe the biggest misconception would be how hard it is. It's particularly, international trips are particularly hard because you're dealing with another government. You're dealing with a country that's used to doing things their own way. The international stories, I think, are some of the best in the country. Now, when the President of the United States comes to someplace like Marshfield, Missouri, to march in the Independence Day parade, my guess is everybody here said, "Whatever you want, whatever we can do to make this work." I did advance for First Lady Barbara Bush, and I will tell you, domestically, they were just so grateful she was coming. But the interesting thing, and this comes out in the book, the number of places that advance teams hated going because they were so difficult. Number one, Russia, or the Soviet Union. We finally just did a whole chapter on advancing the Soviet Union. They were so difficult. The next most difficult place was France. I mean, the advanced teams hated the French. And we actually have a picture, Karen, if you can find the picture of President Carter. He's in Paris while she's looking for that photo. The next most difficult place, oh, there it is. You're good. That's President Carter with, I think it's Giscard d'Estaing. And the advance person, the head of the President Carter's advance team, they were going to march down, what's the Champs-Élysées? Did I say that right? Thank you so much. I knew somebody would spit that out. They weren't going to, the press were not going to get a picture of that. And Paul Costello, who wrote the essay, is trying to tell the French, "I need a flatbed truck that the TV cameras and the photographers, we need this picture." And he fought to the death, and he finally talked him into it. This picture was on the cover of Newsweek magazine. But if they've been up to the French, the most difficult place, and I'm sort of embarrassed to say this, my little brother is a Catholic priest. I'm a longtime Catholic, a lifetime Catholic, the Vatican. And the Vatican's attitude was sort of, yeah, we've been here, 2,000 years, and yeah, we don't need you to tell us what to do. But I will tell you one international story that's easy, quick. Former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates and former head of the CIA, he was an advance person, for God's sakes, earlier in his life. He was in the National Security Council for Presidents Ford and President Carter. And part of his job for international trips, there was something called pre-advance, because international trips were so complicated. It's not the logistics team, but people like Bob Gates would go in advance to plan who's the president going to visit with, what is the substance of the trip. Well, he's meeting with the French president, is probably just staying again, on Martinique, and which was owned by France, and the French thought they were in charge of this visit. So they wanted the two presidents to meet in a cabana on the beach. They thought it would just be the perfect setting, it would be lovely. So Secretary Gates goes to the beach to check it out. It's a topless beach. Oh, no. This is for President Ford. He said he wished it was President Carter because he said it'd be a better story, but it was for President Ford. I know. I should have said that he said that, but and Bob Gates said, no, the two presidents aren't going to meet here. And the French are like, well, what's the problem? And Bob Gates says, the women are all topless. And the French are like, and your point is? Anyway, they did not meet in the cabana on the beach. Wow. But so it's just an answer to your question. There's just stuff that happens that you just have no, by the time, again, Air Force One comes, you just have no idea that at one point in the planning of the event, the French had to be told no topless beaches. And that's why it's a fun book, because there's just lots of stuff like that.
Absolutely. And Jean, you described the world of presidential visits as a mix of Veep and the West Wing. Which president's visit was the most, I guess the best word to say was chaotic to plan?
Okay, you ask hard questions. That's a great question. I think there is a picture, Karen, my new favorite person, of the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush, in Iraq on Thanksgiving Day, and I should have looked up the year. Yeah, that's him with the troops in Iraq and Baghdad. This is either has to be 2005 or 2006, I can't remember. He went secretly to Iraq. And I cannot while we were eating Thanksgiving dinner, he goes to Iraq. The security issues were just huge. And I cannot do justice. The head advance guy wrote the essay. It's an amazing essay about what they went through to make this happen. Even the Iraqis did not know he was coming. The number of people on the ground in Baghdad who knew he was coming. And they took the press. The press had no idea where they were going. It was just the press pool. And they told them once they were in the air, they took their phones, they took their computers, and they said to them, if this gets out where he's headed, we turn this plane around. No one can know. So that was probably, and it became a blueprint. President Obama did a secret trip to Afghanistan, which is in this book. But 43's trip, in Bush world, we say 41 and 43. 43's trip to Baghdad became the blueprint for secretive, they really, Andy Card, who was his chief of staff, Joe Hagan, his deputy chief of staff, and then they really put together the blueprint of how to secretly send a president somewhere. I will tell you two funny stories. One is the man who advanced it, who wrote the essay, they're about ready to, the president's on the ground, the troops are all having Thanksgiving dinner, and they're about ready to announce that the president's there. And it hit him that this was so unlikely that the troops might think it was a comedian imitating the president. And he was terrified that they would all start laughing when the President of the United States, their commander-in-chief, walked out. Well, the good news is they did not. They recognized, yes, this actually was the president. The other funny story, so I'm at home Thanksgiving Day, having a very quiet day off, when my phone rings. And it would be my boss, the father of the president. The president called his parents before it became public to let them know, Mom, Dad, there's something maybe you should know. I'm glad he did that. But then President Bush, 41, called me and said, did you know he was going to do this? Well, no, of course I didn't know. I wouldn't be in the know on something like that. I said, no, sir, I had no idea. And he said, well, you know, George would have told me because I'm his father and I was head of the CIA, and he would have told me, but his mother has a big mouth.
That's great. That's good.
But it's a great essay, how they pulled this off. Wow. It's a miracle they pulled this off, but they did.
That's amazing.
So I think that's my answer to your question.
Wow. So Jean, too, from presidential administration to presidential administration, there has to be some type of seamless, events or people that will maintain that advance quality and credibility. Do you know of instances where, some have, been with Clinton, and then they were with Bush, and then they were with Obama? Do you know any instances
They
of that?
don't typically, they're pretty partisan, but they also respect the job they're trying to do. First of all, a man named Ron Walker, who was the first head of White House Advance. President Nixon is the one who established the office of White House Advance. President Kennedy is the first president who started using Advance. There's actually some stories we found a couple of LBJ people still alive, both in their 90s. They're the oldest stories, but so we start with LBJ, but then he was followed by President Nixon, who decided there needed to be an office of White House Advance. Ron Walker wrote a book which became the Bible of all advance people. And he tells the story, I think we have it in the book. His wife actually wrote the essay, because Mr. Walker was not in good health, that during the 1992 campaign, James Carville, who managed President Clinton's campaign, came up to Ron Walker and said, "I read your book, thank you, but we're just doing it better." But there was a good friend of mine who advanced, I think it was the debate in 2020 between President Trump and President Biden. And she was head of President Trump's advance. And she said they spent a ton of time with President Biden's advance team over drinks in the evening, just giving them advice. Because Therese, who I'm talking about, had advanced for 41 and 43. Wow. Yeah, she was one of our big advance people. So yeah, and the camaraderie this book has created, I have an email blast that there's 96 contributors to this book. And I think they've all become best friends through this book. They've met at some of our events. We did an event in D.C. that a lot of them were at. We're going to do an event in Chicago. There's like 8 of them in Chicago. So it's fun to see the camaraderie, yeah.
How interesting. Now, talking about you personally, Jean, what quality or attribute prepared you most to be the Chief of Staff of George H.W. Bush?
That's a funny question. So I was a newspaper reporter for 10 years, and I took the job to be Barbara Bush's deputy press secretary. And I had to think about it. I was at USA Today. It was going to be a huge pay cut, and I really loved being a reporter. I was going to cover the White House. I came home for Christmas. I grew up on a farm in mid-Missouri, in Audrain County, Missouri. And I came home for Thanksgiving, and I told my dad, I grew up a Democrat. My dad, by this time, was a Republican. He said Jimmy Carter turned all farmers into Republicans because of the Soviet grain deal, but that's another story. But I told him about this job offer, and he said, let me get this straight. You've been offered a job in the White House to work for the First Lady of the United States, and you're thinking about it? He said, what the hell is wrong with you? Yeah. So he was right, and I took the job, and my office, of course, was in the East Wing. A moment of silence for the East Wing. My office no longer exists. It's a pile of rubble, unfortunately. But I found out that part of my job was to advance the First Lady. I had never heard the term. I do know I'm not answering your question, but there's a reason why I started with this. I didn't know what advance was. Anyway, they sent me to New York. The First Lady, her very first trip's going to be to visit a literacy event in New York City. And there's always a Secret Service agent who's part of the advance team. And we do our first meeting with the host group. It was a New York-based literacy group. And I go back to my hotel room. I wanted to crawl under the covers, and there's a knock on the door, and it's a Secret Service agent, and he looked at me and he said, you have no idea what you're doing, do you? And the answer was, no, I do not. So I had to learn I learned on the job how to be an advanced person, and I figured it out with the help of Secret Service and other advanced people. So fast forward, I go to Houston with them after he lost the election in 92 to help Mrs. Bush with her memoirs. She wrote them herself. She'd want me to tell you that. But I was her researcher, her fact checker, her editor. A year later, we were done with the book. It's March 1994. I have a job waiting for me at the Chicago Sun-Times. I was very excited to go back to being a reporter. And President Bush called me into his office. His first post-White House chief of staff was going to retire. And he said, Barbara thinks that maybe you could just help out until I don't know who to hire. He says, I haven't thought about this. I need to figure this out. Would you be willing to stay like through the summer until I can figure this out? And I said, no. I said, sir, I have no idea how to be a chief of staff. I have never been anyone's boss, ever. I'm a writer. I said, I can't bounce my own checkbook. You want me to run your office? And I said, no, 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 no. And he said, just give me till Labor Day. We'll make it up as we go. And I just need someone to keep the seat warm. Those were his exact words. We never talked about it again. I was his chief of staff for 25 years. We got busy. Both George and Jeb were running for governor in 94 in their respective states. I lied. I brought it up to him like 20 years later. And I said, you do know that I'm still waiting for you to walk into my office and tell me, oh, I've hired a chief of staff. You can go now. He swears we never had that conversation, but we did. So you asked me what qualities? I had none. I just made it up. Yeah.
You did a good job.
Well, you know what I figured out? This is a terrible thing to admit to. Because I was George Herbert Walker Bush's chief of staff, I would be in a meeting or on a conference call discussing an event or a project or something important, and when I would give my 2 cents, my opinion on what we should do or not do, everybody said, oh, of course, Jean's right. They just assumed I knew everything, and I didn't. I was sort of like Leonardo DiCaprio in that movie where he was pretended to be, remember that movie where he pretended to be people he wasn't? That was me. But then I eventually caught on, but yeah.
Now, Jean, I think this great audience would love for us to go through those photographs
Okay.
and explain, the significance.
What they're looking at.
Absolutely.
Okay. Karen, there's one photo. I'm going to tell the Bob Dole story, but don't show the photo. Okay? Just leave it right here. We're going to do 2 stories back to back that shows what a difference advance can make. It's 1988. Senator Bob Dole is running for president against Vice President George Bush. He is flying to Florida. It's after the New Hampshire primary, after Iowa. He's flying to Florida, and a friend of his calls him on his campaign plane and says, I have a great idea for a campaign event. Universal Studios is building a theme park outside Orlando. It would be the perfect place for you to talk about the economy, to talk about jobs. You've got to come, and I want you to come this afternoon. I can build a crowd. It'll be a great event. And Senator Dole said, of course. Well, he gets off the phone, and the head of his advance team, Mike Lake, who wrote the essay, is on the plane. And Mike says to him, Senator, let's do this tomorrow, or maybe even 2 days. Let me get an advance team out there. Let's see, we need to see this place, and we need to see what kind of event we can build. And Senator Dole is like, no, 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 my friend wants me to do it this afternoon. I trust him completely. Karen, can we find the photo of Bob Dole? Those are his greeters. That would be, and by the way, there was no one else there. There was a bunch of bulldozers. They were just broken ground. There was no audience. He was greeted by Daffy Duck, Charlie Chaplin, and Frankenstein. He was also greeted by Mae West, but she didn't make the cut. For someone running for president of the United States, this isn't the optic you want. And Senator Dole he had a great sense of humor, and he said the media coverage was huge. There was just nobody else there, no one from Universal, just these cartoon characters. And so he says to the media, I wanted to introduce you to some of the people who I thought I might put in my cabinet. To make the problem worse, he fired a bunch, nothing connected to this, but he fired his top campaign people later that day. And the photo that most of the newspapers in the country ran with the story, this photo. So that's a case where Advance could have made the difference. He would have never gone, they would have told his friend, yeah, what the hell? Now I'm thinking his friend secretly worked for Vice President Bush. I think this could have been a setup. The other picture, but the flip side of this is, Karen, can you find the picture of President Reagan at the Berlin Wall? I think I sent it to you. I sent you all the photos. So I believe it's 1987, the height of the Cold War, and President Reagan goes to Berlin and makes the very famous speech at Brandenburg Gate, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It became a pivotal moment we're trending toward the end of the Cold War. This speech was a pivotal moment. And here's the thing, the pre-advance team goes to Berlin, and the German government and the U.S. Embassy wanted President Reagan to give that speech inside, either in a hotel ballroom, or what they really wanted to do is for him to give it at the Reichstag. Did I say that right? Basically, their Congress. So they're at the Reichstag. They wanted him to address their parliament. And the head of Advance, a wonderful guy named Jim Hooley, who just died a couple months ago, he's looking out the window. And out the window is the Brandenburg Gate. And he turned to the Germans and the U.S. Embassy folks and he said, we're giving the speech right there. And the Secret Service had a complete nervous breakdown, of course. The Germans weren't happy either. They were worried about him drawing a crowd. They were worried about security. They were worried about logistics. Well, to make a long story short, it's a great piece that a guy named Andrew Littlefair is the one who advanced it. Not only were there 25,000 people on the west side of the gate, they got a truck with a bullhorn and drove around up and down the wall announcing to the East Germans that the President of the United States would be at the Brandenburg Gate at this time on this date. They think there could have been 25,000 people on the east side of the wall. So that's a great story of how the head Advance saved the day. If he'd made that speech inside, he could not have said, this isn't ring the same. Mr. Gorbachev, you know that wall out there, out the window? Yeah, tear that wall down. It's not the same. Yeah.
What about
other pictures?
You mentioned, Gene, the Vatican. What about that picture with LBJ and the Pope?
The funny thing about the picture with LBJ and the Pope, that's the oldest photo I did not know this until I wrote this book. The president who is, is that it? Yes, it is. The picture, that's it. That's LBJ and the Pope. They're actually at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City. President Reagan is the president who established diplomatic relations with the Vatican. What happened is after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, there was a rumor, and I would like to assure all the Catholics here, my fellow Catholics, it wasn't true. There was a rumor that Catholics were involved in Lincoln's assassination. And there was a lot of anti-Catholicism in the country at that time because a lot of Irish were coming, a lot of Italians were coming. The Northeast was sort of being flooded by Catholics, and it wasn't overly popular. So Ulysses S. Grant cut off all diplomatic relations with the Vatican, and it was Reagan who reestablished them. But this is Pope Paul VI is the first pope to come to the United States. He came to address the United Nations. He did a mass at Yankee Stadium, and LBJ was very excited the Pope was coming, but he was told by the lawyers and the diplomats, it's better he not come to DC because we don't recognize him as anybody important. So he went to New York and they met there.
Wow.
It's such a bizarre story.
That is.
Yeah.
What about, Gene, the photograph with Bush 41 and Elizabeth II and the pink hat?
Purple.
Purple hat.
Purple
yeah.
hat. So this became sort of a famous incident. We'll wait until the photo pops up, the purple hat story. So Queen Elizabeth is making a state visit to the United States. My boss was the President of the United States. And the welcoming ceremony is on the south lawn of the White House. We may not have, Karen, do we not have the photo? Well, darn it. You're going to have to buy the book. It became known as the talking purple hat story. The president, 6'2", George H.W. Bush, welcomes the Queen to the United States. And he forgets to pull out the little step stool in the podium. She's 5'2", and all you could see was her hat. As you know, typical the Brit, she has on this big purple hat, and it became known as the talking purple hat story. And the Queen has such a great sense of humor. She addressed Congress the next day, and she opened her speech with, "I hope you can see me from where you're sitting," because the story the BBC particularly loved this story. So, should we see what other photos we have in case? Okay. Unfortunately, that would be Vice President George Bush in Iowa in 1988. And the advance man, it was the same guy, Gordon James, who was the advance person for the talking purple hat. He blames himself. He feels he should have crawled up on stage and pulled out the step stool. Anyway, he told the Vice President of the United States to win the Iowa caucus, he had to hold a pig. This pig apparently had not peed for 5 days, because the entire time the vice president is holding him, you really can't tell, but apparently he just peed and peed and peed and peed.
Wow.
Oh, this is a favorite. Some of you will remember this. This photo actually contributed to Governor Dukakis losing in 1988. His campaign knew he had a problem because he was running against the Vice President of the United States, who'd been shot down in World War II, who had been head of the CIA, had been our ambassador to the UN, had been our envoy to China. In other words, Vice President Bush had huge foreign policy and military experience. Governor Dukakis had none. He was the governor of Massachusetts, and he had no foreign policy experience. So his campaign decided to fix it by sending him, it's in Michigan, this is a General Dynamics plant that is building the biggest, newest tank for our military. And the idea was for him to tour the plant, learn about the tank, and then somebody had the bright idea that he should take a ride in the tank. And they put his name on the helmet. This picture actually isn't that bad. I remember this well. I was a reporter. I was not covering this, but I remember when this happened. You couldn't see him. Governor Dukakis was a short man, and everybody just made huge fun, pretending he was driving this tank. It was not a good idea. And the advance guy who writes about it, this became famous, and if my co-author was here, Tom Collimore, he was working for the '88 Bush campaign. He remembers the day he was in campaign headquarters, the day this became news, and he said they immediately started drinking heavily and celebrating. They knew this was right before the World Series. The Bush campaign had already bought a lot of World Series ad time. A video of this became their main ad. And Dukakis dropped about 20 points in the poll. I remember. Yeah. This is considered one of the biggest advance mistakes ever.
That's the first election that I was able to vote.
That you were able to vote,
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, this was another big advance mistake. So President Reagan went to visit the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, asked President Reagan to visit a German military cemetery. Germany had just agreed to let us put air-to-ground missiles in Germany to protect Europe from the Soviet Union. Kohl took a lot of heat from his people for agreeing to this. And he wanted it was important to him that President Reagan visit a cemetery. And there are so many things that went wrong. He assured President Reagan that most of the German soldiers in World War II, were 18-year-old kids, they weren't Nazis, whatever. So he was going to go to a cemetery called Bitburg. And when the pre-advance team went, led by Deputy White House Chief of Staff Michael Deaver, and my friend Jim Hooley was on this trip, the cemetery had gotten 30 to 40 inches of snow a couple days before they arrived, and the graves were all covered with snow. This whole cemetery was full of SS Nazis. Oh, God. The worst of the worst. Among the graves was the head of a concentration camp that was very close to the Bitburg Cemetery. It was a disaster. It was an absolute disaster. And they tried to pull out when the advance team went back and the snow had melted, and they figured out who was buried there. But Cole wouldn't give in. Reagan felt obligated to go. But this was a cartoon. The advance team was blamed, but this was a cartoon, the president laying a wreath of flowers at the tomb of the unknown advance man. It was probably one of the biggest, it made a lot of news. Wow. The Jewish community in particular, it took them a while to get over this, so. Wow. This is that President Nixon? This is a big party he gave on the south lawn of the White House for returning POWs. The Vietnam War is over. The POWs have all returned. And the man who advanced this. And what's interesting about this picture, as you'll see in the book, is one of the people on stage, and I'm not sure, I'm having a hard time seeing it, is Irving Berlin, who of course wrote God Bless America. And it was his last appearance in public. Wow. It was he died not long after that, but he came and honored the POWs to DC to attend this event. Wow. Yeah.
Gene, I know people in the audience want to ask questions, so I'd like to open that up, and anyone who wants to ask a question, please do so now. Marie?
Right. Local law enforcement is very, very important. They work closely with the Secret Service advance and also the staff advance. Local law enforcement is important because they know their town. They know their town, they know their county, they know where the potholes are. They know, so they're a big part of it. And my boss always made a huge point of shaking the hands of every police officer, every sheriff. I think most presidents did that, every state highway patrolman, and it meant a lot to them. But the Secret Service lean on local law enforcement a lot to make sure everything goes smooth from a security viewpoint during advance trips. Well, part of the advance team's job, I don't think this is the vice president or the first lady, but when the president travels, there is a plan where to take him if something happens, if he's, God forbid, shot, or if he has a heart attack. One of the things they make sure, there's always an emergency evacuation plan. And I found this interesting. One of the things they make sure is that the local hospital has a blood supply of his blood, and that's one of the things they got to make sure that there's enough blood on hand, and there's a lot that it goes. The cavity? If they have a cavity or its root canal go bad, the President Clinton had a dentist also as part of the healthcare. Oh, I did not know that as part of his advance. I don't think 41 ever had a cavity. No, I'm I'm teasing. You have to, a dental emergency. They plan for just about everything. They have to. They have to be ready for everything. So, what else would you like to know?
What
Yes, he did. Well, I was his chief of staff. The first book I wrote was called The Man I Knew, and it was about the 25 years I was his chief of staff. It was the best job in America because he was such an amazing person, but he also was exhausting. And there's an entire chapter in that book called I Have an Idea. Those are the four, it would be, Gene, I have an idea. They were the four scariest words the man ever said to me. And he always manages, he was a morning person. I would try to get to the office between 6:30 and 7 and drink a couple cups of coffee because he would have been up since 5, drinking coffee, reading 4 newspapers, watching the news. He'd come busted in the door at 7 a.m. And at least 50% of the time, as he walked through the door, he said, Gene, I have an idea. And I'd be like, oh my God. So one morning, the idea was, Gene, he sat down in my office, he said, I'm thinking I want to parachute again. I'm going to jump out of a plane. So we need to make that happen. And I looked at him, and the first thing I said was, have you told your wife? And he said, I'm going to make her a very strong Manhattan tonight and tell her tonight. So President Bush parachuted out. His plane was shot down during World War II. And what he needed, what do you call it? He hated this term, a better term for close the loop. He needed to, I'll think of it. It haunted him because his 2 crew members died. He was the only one who survived. He parachuted out, was in the water for 3 hours, was picked up by a submarine. And President Bush talked openly that he thought of those 2 crew members every single day of his life. And I think he just needed a do-over. He needed to jump out of the only time he'd ever jumped out of a plane was when he'd been shot down. And so he jumped, we figured it out, and he jumped, 6 or 7 times in his post-presidency, including on his 90th birthday. Wow. He was in a wheelchair, he had Parkinson's disease, and he was 90, and he was gonna parachute out. And his wife told me, and I wanted to say, you're Barbara Bush, you do this. She says, you have to stop this. I have talked to him, and he won't listen to me. You have to stop this. So I did the only thing I could think of. I called his oldest son. I called George W., and I said, told him what was going on, and he said, Gene, what are you afraid of? And I said, what the hell do you think I'm afraid of, Mr. President? I said, I'm afraid your dad won't survive this. And he said, Gene, if you take this away from him, it'll kill him. And if this is how Dad goes out, this is how he would want to go out. Wow. He said, I'm on his side. Let him do this. And I got it, but I said, you talk to your mother. And exactly. He said, I'll talk to Mom. So the funny thing is, the day that he jumped, the weather wasn't great, and there was some talk of canceling it. And he jumped with the Army Golden Knights, and at this point he was jumping with some of the retired Army, the Golden Knights. Anyway, we're going to go up to the house. They came and made the decision that he could jump. It was safe to jump. And the guy who he jumped with, a wonderful guy named Mike, President Bush, they were both there. President Bush's medical aide, they were all going to go in and tell Mrs. Bush the jump would happen. And somebody in the house, she saw them out the window, and I was with them, and somebody came out and said, she will only talk to Gene. She does not want to talk to any men. So I went in, I'm like, oh, thank you. I went in and told her, and she said, I figured that's why you were all coming. Fine, and I'll be there, but I don't want to talk to them. And then she said, she goes outside, and she says to President Bush, her husband, of nearly, they had been married 73 years by the time he died, 4 years later. She said to him, I just figured out this is quite convenient because he was jumping onto the lawn of their church in Kennebunkport, St. Anne's Episcopal Church. And she said, if you die, we're just going to carry you inside and have the funeral.
That's great.
Did I answer your question? Okay.
Any other questions?
You know, that he was, I can't remember exactly when he was diagnosed. That's a great question. In 2005, while we were all having Christmas dinner 2004, a huge tsunami hit South Asia. And the president at that time was George W., and it's considered one of the world's disasters, in natural disasters in world history. He asked President Bush and President Clinton, his dad, to join together to raise money for the nonprofits like the Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, AmeriCares. They were all racing to the region, but they all needed hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, this was a huge disaster. And then the president sent his dad and President Clinton in February to all the countries hit by the tsunami to represent him and to tell the heads of state, America, we've got your back. And I went with them on that trip, and they left as colleagues with two former presidents with a joint cause, and they came home best friends. And the reason I'm telling you this is he had not been diagnosed yet, but I was really worried about President Bush on this trip, so was Mrs. Bush. She didn't go. He was very unsteady on his feet. He obviously had Parkinson's. This would have been February 2005, and I think he was diagnosed later that year. But he had a hard time sometimes getting up and down. He was just, for someone who was a great athlete, he was really unsteady. So on the plane on the way over, I had never met President Clinton. I took him into my confidence, and we said, there's something going on with him. Could you please just keep an eye on him and don't leave him behind, and maybe help him up and down stairs and help him get up? He was amazing. He was truly amazing. He took President Bush under his wing, but he was very discreet about it. The flip side of this is George Herbert Walker Bush has never been late in his life for anything. President Clinton has never been on time for anything in his life. Marie, am I right? Never been on time. So about day 2 of the trip, this was driving President Bush crazy. We were in Sri Lanka, and the president, who had a huge task ahead of her, I think Prime Minister, anyway, she gave them basically a state dinner. And President Bush felt strongly it was time for them to go. The dinner was over. He knew she either needed probably to go back to work. Sri Lanka had just been devastated by this storm, or maybe get some sleep. So I told President Clinton's staff, he's ready to go. President Bush is ready to go. And President Clinton's working the room and talking to everybody. And they said, oh, we don't, he decides when he leaves. We don't pull him. So I told President Bush that, and he said, I got this. He walked up to President Clinton, came up behind him, tapped him on the shoulder and said, Bill, it's time to go home. Get in the car. And President Clinton looked at him and said, yes, sir. And this went on the whole trip. And one morning, we're in Thailand, and he got better and better. President Bush, I do think, was the father he never had. But he comes out of the hotel. I'm on the porch trying to decide if it's time to call his room and say, hello. Anyway, President Bush is in the car reading a book. He comes out on the porch. Can I say a bad word? It's not a horrible word. He comes out on the porch. He doesn't know I'm standing there. He sees President Bush in the car, and he said, oh, shit, I'm in so much trouble. They came home from that trip best friends. But anyway, that was a long answer to when he was diagnosed with Parkinson's. I think sometime later that year. And I had to remind him after he went into a wheelchair, he was the president who passed the ADA Act and the Americans with Disabilities. And we were in downtown Houston one day having lunch, beautiful day. Just wanted to take a walk. He was in a wheelchair. And he said, oh my gosh, I'm so proud of Houston because they have wheelchair ramps at all the intersections. Isn't that great that Houston? And I looked at him and I said, excuse me? I said, you know why they're there. The ADA bill. And he said, oh, you're right. Yeah, this is all about me. Wow. Any other, do we have to go? I guess we have to go. No? Any other questions? Pictures, what picture? Go back to, that's the Clintons in Africa. This is a funny story. Their president of the United States here and first lady, he was the first president to go to this country. I cannot remember what it was, but the first lady of the African country decided she was in charge of their visit. The advance guy writes a really funny story how difficult it was working for the first lady. What other pictures do we have, Karen? Oh, I love this picture. This just shows, I hope you can see it. It's a little dark. I don't think you can see it. President Clinton they're about ready to sign the Oslo Accords. And in that photo is King Hussein of Jordan, President Mubarak of Egypt, of Israel, it's Prime Minister Rabin, and Yasser Arafat's also in that photo. President Clinton's aide very quietly tells him that his tie is crooked. He needs to straighten his tie. What is amusing is when the President of the United States started fiddling with his tie, all the other heads of state started, and their ties weren't crooked. But it just shows they all, if you saw the picture, you could see it clearly. Again, you're going to have to buy the book. They also, of course, Arafat did not have on a tie. But it's just a funny photo of how the President of the United States is straightening his tie. Well, we better straighten ours too. By the way, President Clinton's photographer won a big award for this photo. She was smart enough, I can't remember her name, but she was smart enough, what is it? Sharon, snapped this photo and won at the end, one of those photography Journalism of the Year awards. It's a very funny photo. This is taken, the day that Sarah Jane Moore tried to assassinate President Ford. That's the beginning of the chapter 3, Advancing History. And the picture we decided to run, the picture of the Secret Service pushing him into the car in San Francisco and saving his life, everybody has seen this. His photographer, he's a very famous photographer, David, I'll think of it who? Dude, never tell him I could not think of his name. It would kill him. David Kinnerly. That's exactly who it is. Thank you. David Kinnerly, this is the photo he wanted us to run. This is him hugging his daughter Susan when he got home. And it just shows how human, it just shows how human they are. What else do we have? Oh, this is do we have time to tell this story? This is Vice President Bush. He's in St. Louis. He did an event around noontime in St. Louis, and he has a speech in Minneapolis that night. His good friend George Pillsbury had asked him to come to Minneapolis to do an event, and they get to the airport, and Air Force Two is broken down. I don't think it's complete. There's something, the pilots just said there was something going on with Air Force Two and said, Mr. Vice President, we're not flying this plane. And so he looks at his team. My co-author is in this picture. He has his back to the camera. But by the closest to the plane is his chief of staff, Craig Fuller, wearing sunglasses. They're at the private aviation field in St. Louis. And he looks out across the tarmac and sees a plane. The engine's on. It's about ready to take off. And he sends one of these people running to the plane to see if he would loan it to the vice president. And the Secret Service do the tail number and check it out quickly. And anyway, this poor guy, he had a story to tell the rest of his life. He was not headed to Minneapolis. But these people show up and say, the Vice President of the United States needs to go to Minneapolis. Can we hijack your plane? He said, yes. God love him. He said, yes, we did pay for it. But this is the day they hijacked a plane. And they're all looking at that plane. Quickly, this is another pivotal moment in the end of the Cold War. This is 1987. That's Vice President George Bush with Lech Walesa in Poland. And the Polish communist government did everything they could to keep these two men apart. And again, it's the advance team who managed to sneak Lech Walesa. He just gotten out of prison, I think. He's still the opposite. The communists are still in charge here. They snuck Walesa to the U.S. Embassy residence, snuck him into the vice president's motorcade. The president was already going to this church to lay a wreath at the grave of a Catholic priest who had been assassinated by the communists, basically. He was a leader, an opposition leader. And the communist government was a little stunned when the vice president walks out with Lech Walesa. And again, the advance team had done an amazing job. They think there was at least 10,000 Poles there that day. And Walesa at one point wrote, his appearing with the vice president of the United States was a huge game changer in Poland because it sent a message to the communist government, to the Polish people, probably to Moscow. America's on our side. He said this photo was a game changer. Wow. It's a great story. This is President Obama with Oprah Winfrey. And when she endorsed him, it was a huge deal. And the advance guy, I think it was a guy, wrote a funny story about the only problem with this endorsement. This would have been when was he elected? 2008. Thank you. 2008. The problem was she was the big celebrity. And the advance team had to remind the people there, okay, but Senator Obama's also a big deal. Yeah, but Oprah's here. He writes a funny story about it. This is 9/11, and this is the last story. This is George W. at Ground Zero. This is the day that he stood on the burned fire truck with the bullhorn and said, "Can you hear me?" His head of advance, Brian Montgomery, who was with him on 9/11 and with him every single day for the next 4 or 5 days. Brian's essay is amazing. And again, you all know what 9/11 is, but what's fun about this book is to see some of these behind the scene details on how some of this came about. The amazing thing about Brian's essay, the day they're in New York at 9/11, he gets home and his shoes are covered with white dust. And I almost wish he hadn't told me this. And he said he knew that it was the dust, of course, of the buildings coming down. And he also thinks there was some human remains in that dust. It's hard to fathom. To this day, it'll be the 25th anniversary of 9/11 in September. He put his shoes in a plastic bag and never cleaned them. Never wore them again, never cleaned them. They still sit in his closet. Wow. Which was a nice thing to do. Absolutely. It's a great essay. Wow. That might be, do we have anything else, Karen? And this is President Obama and Sandy Hook. And again, it's like some other stories. He told the staff to clear the room. He needed the room. He's getting ready to go out and speak to a community who had just lost their entire first grade class. Everybody in that town knew someone who was shot that day. I'm very grateful to his photographer, Pete Souza, who shot this photo before he left the room. But this is just a president trying to pull it together before addressing a heartbroken community. And the young, well, he's not young anymore, but the advanced man who advanced it, his name is Manju, he had a first grade son. And when he was driving home after advancing this, he writes, his essay ends, he felt guilty he had a son to go home to. Wow. But it just shows, a very human side. I think that's it. I will tell you, there are no books out there. I know you're all dying to buy this book. And for like 10 copies. I'm teasing. But come see me. There's no books for sale, but you can buy it at your bookstore, Amazon, bookshop.org. And if you think you're going to buy a book, I will stick around for a while. I have with me book plates that were made just for this book. They're already signed by my co-author. So come see me. I've already signed a couple. I'm happy to sign a book plate for you, and then you just tear off the back and put it inside your book. But thank you for coming. This was a lot of fun. Thank you for having me back, Massee. I appreciate it.
Yes.
So.
Jean, thank you for being a personal friend of mine, being a friend to the Missouri Cherry Blossom Festival for the Society of Presidential Descendants, and lastly, she is on our commission. She's on our National First Ladies Day Commission. She is helping us with the scholarship committee.
Okay, he's about ready to kill me, but thank you. We got it, Pierce, I have to introduce you. Yes, I am. So Pierce Bush, President Bush's grandson, He's the son of Neil Bush. He's here in the back. He's given a speech at 1:20 about his grandmother. So at 1:30? Where are you? Here?
It's going to be at the auditorium.
The auditorium. Go hear Pierce is a great speaker. I'm not just saying this because he's sitting back there. He truly is one of my favorite grandkids. I don't really like the others. I only like you, Pierce. But anyway, it's fun to have him here.
Gotcha.
Thank you, Karen. Did y'all hear that? Go hear Pierce. Yes, it is on Audible. And I haven't listened to it, but somebody told me the other day it's really good. That the audio people did a good job. I need to listen to it while I'm in the car, don't I? I did not tape it. I didn't. I taped the last one, but I didn't tape this one. So they hired a bunch of actors in New York.